is Allison Yakabe. I'm the lead cybersecurity analyst at the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. We're located not far from here in the Federal Building. And we're one of 79 fusion centers stood up after 9/11 to facilitate information sharing from local government, local police, law enforcement, up to the feds, and vice versa to prevent another mass casualty or terrorist-related incident. So over time, our mission has evolved to include cybercrime, physical security, and other real-time criminal intelligence applications. So we got into drones, or UAS. I use them interchangeably. We got into it as a matter of physical security, where we work with public and private sector partners in 15 counties up and down the Northern California coast to share real-time criminal intelligence information. And these building owners and operators were first concerned with the physical security threats posed by UAS to the public, to people attending their events. So our first relationships were built with special event support, stadiums, and security officials. And over time, we've seen law enforcement themselves want to get involved in drones, with drones for their own public safety applications. So on one hand, we're looking at the threat, and the other hand, we're looking at utility and potential for increasing public safety. So there's risk from both sides. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing as a law enforcement agency, a coordination effort among law enforcement entities, and then also how we've engaged with the community and ways that we've mitigated risk posed by UAS so far. I work well with pictures, so I've built for you a collage of suspicious activity reports that the NCRIC has received. That's our primary mechanism for obtaining criminal information. So our public and private sector partners relay suspicious activity reports to us. These are specifically related to drones. Top left, you have a water treatment facility where a disgruntled employee made verbal threats that he was going to poison the water supply using a UAS. So in the intelligence space, we would consider that not a credible threat. He had the intent, however, he did not have the capability. It was just language. So we do work with law enforcement partners to follow up on a lot of these perceived threats and get the ground truth through consensual contact. That's really the law enforcement response to any kind of drone activity, is getting as much information as possible. These guys are great working on the ground. Second, this is drone diving of Salesforce Tower, right down here. It's the tallest building in the city, and it attracts a lot of interest from enthusiasts, hobbyists, malicious and otherwise, or malicious and harmless. And drone diving is a thing where you go to the top of the building and you just fall. So they like to post those on YouTube, and we get them all the time, and people want to know, well, what can we do about it? Well, we know this guy, we know what he looks like, he's very popular, but not really a threat. So we're still happy to take those reports. The cool thing about a fusion center is that we can preserve information and intelligence files for a year based on suspicious activity criteria that meets certain thresholds. So it's still important for tracking purposes that we receive this information, but we don't necessarily need a case number. So that's kind of nice. Next we have a maritime drone, which is really a remotely piloted boat. But it was interesting because we haven't seen it a lot. It looks very menacing. So we were happy to take a report on that. That came in from one of our federal partners. Top right, a drone swarm, which was really cool for the Olympics. Photoshop may or may not have been involved. However, we have also seen this tactic in our area of responsibility, where a swarm of 6 drones was overflying a corrections institution. I know we had corrections here this morning, so kind of keeping tabs on the different types of infrastructure where UAS are often frequent visitors. Bottom left is the Napa fires. We had interference with a fire helicopter, and that was actually a citizen's arrest because the law enforcement officer didn't have any on-view charges. So kind of an interesting application for a way that we can take action against a malicious operator when law enforcement doesn't actually see it. Bottom center is my hometown, Pacifica, and there was a long line rescue going on, and law enforcement actually cited the guy for interfering with a helicopter operation, and it was called misdemeanor sightseeing by drone. I thought that was creative. So the next one is a destroyed drone. It was one that crashed into a power line. down in the South Bay. It was really a Silicon Valley love story because two people met flying drones out around their residences, decided to fly together, ended up clipping a power line, and that's all that was left of the drone. It also cut power to 1,600 people in the area, including some municipal buildings. The interesting thing here, is the insurance guy here? Is he here? Oh. Okay, so the interesting thing here is that the utility whose power was cut actually didn't pursue charges against the two offenders because it would have cost them more money to take action than it would to just quickly repair it and get power back. So I don't know how that works for insurance, but interesting for us. And then bottom right, I'm sure you've all heard of Tracy Mapes. He's pretty famous, the drone leaflet guy. This is all open source. So he dropped leaflets with propaganda at Stanford, Levi Stadium in Santa Clara, and then the Oakland Coliseum. And this image is actually the drone that he modified himself to drop these leaflets. So the dropping mechanism is very concerning from a WMD perspective. We just had a whole conference on that with FBI 3 weeks ago, just for the novel applications of that dispersal mechanism. Okay, so moving on beyond what we're seeing, how does the NICRIC actually work to mitigate risk in the UAS space with regard to law enforcement and public safety? So the first is that we function as a repository for suspicious activity reports. There's really no way for anyone to report a drone-specific incident beyond, so the channels are to the FAA, and we don't really know where those go. DHS is trying, Rob knows this, DHS is trying to get a handle on it by collecting information from the fusion centers. So that's also a good way to report. So we have all these suspicious activity reports we started collecting in 2013, and we have a pretty good idea of the context and best practices for positive enforcement. The context and best practices really revolve around the 4 different types of drone activities. So you have sightings, encounters, accidents, and incidents. And a suspicious activity report can take any one of those. And the most nefarious are obviously the incidents. And that would be what Mapes was, the leaflet dropper. And the NICRIC really provides services to our public and private sector partners in that we can do reasonable person tests. We go out to sites, identify likely drone launch points where a bad actor might launch before getting involved, and best practices in terms of what's actually possible. The technology is moving so fast. Right now, detection really isn't enough. So by the time a UAS is on-prem, there's nothing you can do. Like, even if you've detected it a minute ago, it's too late. We do provide follow-through. I'm sure you guys follow the news. There are a lot of open source reports and media reports of dangerous operators being cited or action being taken against them, and that's not always the case. A lot of times it's publicized, but the charges aren't forthcoming, or the FAA drags their feet, and there are really only a handful of cases that have successfully that are being followed through on the federal level. So we're trying to increase that by increasing our reporting. In the NICRIC area of responsibility, Bay Area in particular, we do have a pretty good handle on emerging threats. Because of all you guys in the startup space, we run into you all the time testing your new technology, and you're very forthcoming with information. And I mean, everyone wants to be a good citizen if you're doing a legitimate application, right? So that's been really helpful, and because of our location, we do have pretty cutting edge reports with regard to other fusion centers. And finally, for baselining, that's one of the main ways that law enforcement enforces against UAS is that they know what's common for their area or their facility. So identifying what's out of range for a specific location. I want to give a nod to the Park Service. They've been really good at getting their drone policy in place in ways to enforce against nefarious operations, and we get great reporting from them, and so far they seem to have a really good handle on countering UAS through policy and enforcement. Speaking of policy and enforcement, that's one of the ways that the NICRIC has added value, is that we do have a tab on what's going on at the federal level, and we can bring that down to our local partners to give them teeth in terms of enforcement. So the types of information they need to collect when they do encounter operators about the device, about intent, so that we can properly file those reports and get them up to the relevant federal agencies. At the same time, we are pushing down federal guidelines. There are some great checklists out there for law enforcement to gather the information that they need, and then providing status updates on legislation. There's a lot of confusion in California about jails and corrections because there was a law that was intended to be passed, but it didn't quite make it. So there's still no real enforcement options at the local level. I do want to touch briefly on the way that we've helped with crafting creative local ordinances. So in a similar way to the misdemeanor sightseeing, we've seen some really creative local ordinances around special events. Levi Stadium has their own, or City of Santa Clara has their own no drone ordinance that was initiated specifically for Levi Stadium. And then I think it was Jeff talking about cyber threats and vulnerabilities. So drones as agents and prey of cyber attack is kind of where we are right now as our local law enforcement want to deploy drones. So we're really concerned about data security for them with criminal justice information sharing standards and compliance on that level. So that's a whole other area of policy that we're getting involved in. Also with education and dialogue, I love coming to presentations and talking about the NCRIC because the more public and private sector partners we can engage, the better we are able to get that reporting and kind of pursue voluntary standards, which is where we're headed. So specifically in the NCRIC area of responsibility in the Bay Area, the way that I see the drone threat kind of evolving in the next year is customizations. So as a cyber analyst, someone had the Arduino, I think it was Jeff. As a cyber analyst, the amount of possibilities and in terms of protocols that an enthusiast could develop for themselves that aren't really tied to any major manufacturer like DJI, anyone who can engineer their own protocols and customize their drones actually has a huge advantage over any kind of counter UAS. And if someone wants to go under the radar that way, I think customizations and do-it-yourselfers are the ones that we need to be worried about. From a law enforcement perspective, we're very concerned with UAS and for evidence implications, chain of custody, but also all the UAS that are abandoned. So we do have a lot of accidents, and getting information off of those quickly in a timely manner is something that's important to us in terms of closing cases on malicious operators, or reckless ones as well. Data security from a law enforcement perspective, so it's kind of a bad thing if you have officers flying their personal drones for their department. That just makes me really nervous. So concerned about data security in terms of what they're collecting. It's one thing if it's a fire safety or a CAL FIRE, the fire organizations, if they're doing reconnaissance before drawing fire lines. It's another thing if you're doing surveillance on a drug bust. So we want to make sure that we're doing things the right way. In the same way that we've helped law enforcement to craft local ordinances, we're helping them to craft policies so that they can deploy drones. We also did this with ALPR, license plate reader technology. We've gone to city councils, kind of demystifying the whole process, but also ensuring that we're meeting these data security standards. For counter UAS, I think that we're almost beyond the detection phase. We really do need to move into a preventive and proactive phase because, as I said, by the time we see something on-prem, we've missed it. I've been on some really terrible demos where you can identify the drone, but you have no idea where the operator is, which does not help us at all. Hobby groups. These 6 are just a sampling of the meetups that occur in the Bay Area. I think there are 18 going on this month. And working with these guys, is it Drone Girl? That's a really good one. Working with these guys specifically in terms of information that we can collect, but also pursuing voluntary standards. I know some departments actually, law enforcement departments, have their own applications where users can kind of sign up and say, you know what, I'm part of this university. I fly every Tuesday for my class. near this building. And so we have a relationship with those individuals. We know they're not there to cause trouble, and it just prevents us from deploying resources unnecessarily. So that's a definite win. And approaching the drone industry itself as a critical infrastructure sector in terms of meeting those policies, policy guidelines, data security standards, and also for counter UAS. So that was why I was really excited to come to this event and kind of engage with the people who are developing, manufacturing, and selling the technology that we're concerned about. Also, the NASA-FAA relationship is really interesting because the FAA is actually mandated to implement whatever NASA comes up with for unmanned traffic management. They're working on some urban air mobility stuff that is really interesting for San Francisco as an urban environment. But the way I see small UAS in particular, I think unmanned traffic management and detection and sense and avoid is kind of an exciting space right now. And looking forward to where that heads. So I am participating in my mission to get us back on track. And I think that's all I have. Any questions?
I have a question. So, and this is something that I always kind of talk about, where and how many. Do you guys have any idea about how many drones are flying around, let's say, on your average day in San Francisco?
Certain building owners and operators have technology that have provided them with baselines.
I like that. So, but I mean, do we have a number? Is it hundreds, thousands, 50?
1,000. On a day.
Allison, you have a question?
Yes, I have two actually. Did I hear you imply that the state park system now has control of the national airspace over them to be able to create rules about an unmanned aerial vehicle flying over a park?
The state parks, no, but the national parks have you can't take off or land on a national park. And so since it's such a scenic area, they get a lot of traffic and people don't know the regulations. So if they're standing on park property, they can enforce against that.
Understandable, but not so for state or county parks or city parks.
Correct.
Okay, even though some of those entities are making rules to control the airspace.
You are very wise. The FAA is going to preempt them on that every time.
Okay, and my second question is, did I hear you say that you are acting as a source for policy for public safety and developing the use of drones within departments? I thought you said that.
As for federal policy?
No,
Oh.
just policy and public safety, fire law.
In terms of information sharing, yes, we can absolutely provide best practices to enforcement agencies who want to deploy drones, but we would never develop their policy.
Well, no, I'm looking for role models, examples, stuff like that.
We could point you in the direction of agencies who've done so successfully.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
I'm Paul Hayes, California State Parks. I'm the mayor proponent of the department. Just to clarify, the National Park Service established a blanket policy prohibiting drones in 2016. And State Parks has not produced a blanket policy. However, in our 22 districts that manage some 280 properties across the state, a majority have posted superintendent orders prohibiting drones, unless specifically authorized and permitted, which we often do, particularly in Southern California parks. A lot of film permits issued, lots of positive activity. Know before you fly.
So man, if I just so I'm clear on that. So over a state park, the state park is issuing a
Superintendent order.
now the superintendent's order then would supersede the federal national airspace.
No, it would not.
So my question is this: if there is a drone flying flying over a state park at 150 feet and it took off outside of the park and landed outside of the park, that would be legal or illegal?